So the precursor to the later form of resistance. So you cancel, assimilationism falls by the wayside after the Second World War. Okay? After the Second World War, it is replaced really by a kind of black African nationalism. Now the Second World War is even more transformative in its impact. I said in the First World War, you had blacks going there. In the Second World War, it was even more transformative. In the Second World War, even more blacks were taken into fight. Between the First World War and the Second World War, there were already small numbers of Africans living and in Europe, and accustomed to European way of doing things, to the cities. But the Second World War is the big turning point. And it is from the Second World War that we can talk of the rapid growth and spread of African nationalism. And here, the difference is that the African leadership had shifted a lot from the early leadership at the beginning of the formation of African organizations. And the demands were now for independence. With African nationalism, the demands were for independence. Okay?
After World War II.
After World War II. That demand. You see the radicalization of the ANC in the 40s. If you read the history of the ANC, and you have to read the history of the ANC, you will see their reformism through the 20s and the 30s, and then the shift coming from the young men in the Youth League, and the growth of a kind of radicalism and African nationalism. You see this throughout the continent, the same pattern. In Ghana, where Nkrumah comes back, Kwame Nkrumah comes back from London. He's brought back from London by elders who established an organization to take up the struggle against the British. And he's brought back because in 1945, there's a famous Pan-African convention in Manchester. And Nkrumah was there, and Kenyatta was there, and all the big names that later become the big men in African politics. But he is brought back. And what the lesson in his coming back is important, because who brings him back are an educated and quite well-off elite. So black African nationalism post World War II is also very much a kind of petty bourgeois, middle class, business-oriented elite. And he's a firebrand, but he's in their employ. He becomes a full-time organizer for the Convention People's Party. Okay? But the orientation of the movement and of so many of the nationalist movements is speaking the language of the people, but actually being very much based around an elite. But we'll talk of the African people, or the Ghanaian people, or the South African people. Do you get the point I'm making? Yes. What we call the class basis of these movements was very middle class. Yeah. It was very middle class. And they were making demands because it could be good for black business. It could be good for the growth of their class. Anyway, Nkrumah eventually breaks with them. Nkrumah eventually breaks with the people who brought him into, brought him back to Ghana, or at that time the Gold Coast. And when he breaks with them, because he thinks they're far too moderate, when he breaks with them, he again relies on young, unemployed youth in the city. They're called the veranda boys. People, young kids, and whipped up passions amongst these young kids who were hanging out, you know, the veranda boys, basically the stoep veranda in Accra. Wow. And the story of Ghana is very interesting in the story of African resistance, because it goes through all these phases, from the uprisings that are to conserve and defend the order amongst the Asante people. The Asante people, for instance, through the 1870s, until the British just ruthlessly put them down, through conservative forms of protest, establishment of a black nationalist African organization with links to Pan-African ideas. Now, this period then, this very short period, we'll see that by the time the British and French begin to withdraw from Africa, in the 50s, they had hardly begun to establish the institutions very firmly. If one actually looks at the African history, it's actually a very short period. Lots of damage in a very short period. Lots of damage in a very short period, and the institutions for running the colonies were actually not very strong, were actually not very widespread or very deeply enrooted. So let's just look at the story of Ghana, because Ghana is seen as the first independent African country. It's actually Sudan. Now, what period we're talking about is 56, 57. Okay? But before independence comes to Ghana, full independence, the British has a timeline from the 40s, which mid-late 40s, which talks of, firstly, you give them responsible government. So what you say is they can have elections, but we'll have a governor general. So they can have democratic elections, but not government yet. Maybe a few people in the ministry or a minister. Then from representative government, we give them responsible government. Okay? So they had a number of stages. They had about 10 years. Ghana was very well prepared in quote-unquote Western liberal democratic procedures. Okay? How to organize elections, the organization of lower house and high, all the paraphernalia, all the institutions. It's important for us to think about this also, because they had all the procedures for about 10 years before they became independent. Now, lots of there were lots of conflicts between opposing parties. But the Ghanaian process was quite orderly. Okay, so here was a process which was orderly. Ghana did not have an armed insurrection to get its independence. Okay, there were protests against the British. People got killed, but it was actually, in the bigger picture, quite a peaceful transition. The same with the Sudan. And we can look at the Sudan. I'm just looking at British colonies. It was quite a peaceful transition. So in the northern, for many of those places in that part of the continent, it's very different to Southern Africa. Okay, we can look at Southern Africa at the end of this. But Southern Africa was extremely brutal and drawn out armed struggles. So the nature of people's consciousness here about armed insurrection is very different to many parts of Africa. Nigeria didn't have it. Okay. Let me just conclude with Ghana here. 10 years, almost 10 years, we can get it around about 10 years. The tragedy for Ghana is that it's post-independence 20 years after, say by 1966, 77, even 88. This period, it had more military rule. That was the tragedy of independence. It had more military rule. Nkrumah didn't last very long. There was a coup against him when he was out of the country. He had about, I think about in the early 60s, he was overthrown. And it is said that he loved Africa more than he loved Ghana. He was the Pan-African. I always thought of Mbeki like that. Loved Africa more, you know, because people would always say he's there, he's all over the world. I think Zuma likes Nkandla more. sorry. I don't know, but you know, do you like the Nkandla more, or do you like Africa more? So they said Nkrumah loved Africa more than he loved, because he was the man who attempted to establish the West African Federation of African states, and then to have the United States of Africa. Yeah. These are Nkrumah's ideas. You must read his ideas. Some of them you might think us now crazy and so on, but it was important at the time. And he brought many people, Africa, he brought, not many, but he brought important figures from the Caribbean, from African Americans and South Africans. You know who represented Ghana once as a Ghanaian at international fora was Miriam Makeba. She went to live there. So Ghana, the independence of these African states. Remember where South Africa was in 56, 57, in the heart of apartheid. Yes. Under Verwoerd and all that laws that were promulgated by Verwoerd in that period. So it was an important symbol of African agency, African independence for us. But the later history was very disappointing, you know. Why did that happen? Why did the military play such a big role? The other thing to reflect on that economists have always spoken about, the other thing that is, if we looked at the economy of Ghana at this period, when the British left, Ghana was actually the one colony because of its gold and its cocoa. It was the one economy that had a surplus. The British left the Ghanaian, the new Ghanaian state with quite a nice surplus. And comparative studies have been done between Ghana and Korea at that time. Korea was much poorer, and they said that they put their money on Ghana to become the model state for growth and development, blah, blah, blah. And of course, that just didn't happen if one looks at what happened in Korea. But there's complicated factors in Korea, the Cold War and American involvement there, which we won't go into. Okay. So here we have a case of an African nationalist organization, Black African Nationalism. And you can go and study the Ghanaian case. You can study, and if you want to look at a case study, we can go again. Yeah.
Where does this conception of the socialist democratic, when it comes to Nkrumah, that we should go to that socialist democracy?
Yeah. Well, you see, Nkrumah was very oriented to the Eastern Bloc. He was oriented to the Eastern Bloc. But I think these were really ideas that were still only rooted amongst an elite. You know, they weren't mass. We didn't really have the development of real mass movements in the case of Ghana, and he had lots of opposition from interest groups located in the cocoa producing area amongst the Asante cocoa growers. He had lots of opposition from them, and he reacted very harshly against them. Put many people into prison. I mean, that's the unfortunate thing.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not an economist, but it is complicated because these African societies were very largely rural agrarian societies. The experiments of Nyerere was the experiment that attempted to create a socialist state in a highly agrarian society and to create these Ujamaa communities and so on, which in the end did not succeed. Okay? But Nyerere's model and his ideas are important. These are important as South Africans because of the importance they gave to South Africa. But internally, again, I'm not familiar with any newer analyses, but they brought in some fine economic minds to advise them how to transform their societies. Nyerere was the most explicitly conscious that you can create conditions for socialist transformation through agrarian land reforms and so on. Ultimately, it was the role of the party. You see, this is how we have destroyed African politics, because the party, he tried to destroy all the local inherited positions from the chiefs and the old systems. But what happened is simply the party people took those places. Okay, so it was never genuinely going to be a democracy of the people, because the party was there having a very strong hand in it. Okay, but the idea of African socialism, does find ground and is it's dead now. I mean, it's absolutely, because everybody's thinking of how we can become the biggest and best capitalist country. But the 70s was a period, 60s and 70s was a period when it was very much alive.